Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're diving deep into something you use every single day, probably without even realizing it.
Oh, yeah,
It's grammar.
absolutely.
We're unpacking a section from, it's called TKT Module 1.
Okay.
Sounds maybe a little dry,
A little bit.
but it's actually super fascinating, especially if you've ever thought about, teaching language or just how language works, period.
Right.
The nuts and bolts.
Yeah. The mechanics of it
So get ready to unlock some secrets about how we actually build meaning with
and
words.
how those rules can sometimes, change and evolve over time too, which is
Right.
sort of wild.
Yeah, it's like language is alive.
It is.
So this guide starts off by asking, what is grammar?
Mm.
Seems simple, but
Yeah. Deceptively simple.
it's actually like kind of profound.
It really is. The source we're looking at defines grammar as how we combine, organize, and change words to make meaning.
Yeah.
It's like the blueprint for communication.
Okay, so it's not just about memorizing a bunch of stuffy rules.
Not at all. It's about understanding the system that lets us express ourselves clearly and be understood.
So it's about function more than just like, following rules.
Exactly. And the source makes this really cool distinction between two sides of grammar, you know, form and use.
Okay, break those down for us. What's the difference?
Well, think of it this way. Form is the kind of what it looks like,
Mhm.
the structures, the patterns, like adding an S to make a noun plural or, S shing for a gerund.
So cat becomes cats. That's form. But what about use?
Use is all about how do those structures actually convey meaning in different situations?
Okay.
Like, why are we using the language?
Yeah.
The source has this awesome example. She's doing her homework. Now, depending on context, that same sentence can have three totally different meanings.
Wait, so the same exact sentence, the same form can mean different things.
Totally. It could mean she's literally doing her homework right now. It could mean she's, scheduled to do it later.
Mm.
It could even mean, like, there's been a change in her habits, like now she's regularly doing her homework. The form is the same, but the meaning shifts based on the context.
That's wild. I never thought about it that way. So what you're saying is just knowing the rules, the form, isn't enough to really get grammar.
It's like having all the ingredients for a cake, but not knowing how to combine them
Yeah.
or like what cake you're even trying to make. You need the recipe. You need the use to guide you.
The use, and that's where understanding context comes in.
Huge. Think about it.
Well,
We tailor our language to the situation all the time. We talk differently to a friend than we would to our boss.
right.
We write differently in a text message versus like a formal email.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Our word choices, the tone, even the grammar itself changes based on context.
So grammar isn't just about being correct. It's about being effective in different situations.
Exactly. And that's why just memorizing rules, in isolation, it won't really get you very far. You got to understand how those rules play out in the real world, in communication.
This makes me think about the challenges of teaching grammar then, too, because if it's all about context, how do you even begin to teach that?
That is where things get really, really interesting. And it's something this TKT Module 1 gets into as well. One of the big takeaways is that traditional grammar, the way it's often taught, it really prioritizes the written form,
Yeah.
which can be so different from spoken language.
Oh, for sure.
All those nuances of conversation, like the slang we use, the interruptions, even just incomplete sentences, that's real grammar too.
So are you saying that, like, traditional grammar lessons might be missing the mark when it comes to real-world communication?
They can be, especially if they're just focused on, memorizing and ignore how dynamic language really is. So it's crucial for teachers to find that balance between accuracy, the form, and fluency, the use.
Accuracy and fluency.
Got it. This TKT Module 1 section, it also points out that grammatical rules themselves, they're not set in stone. They actually, change over time.
Oh, they absolutely do. Language is constantly evolving. Think about words like thou, thee,
Right.
common once, but hardly anyone uses them now. Same with some grammar structures, like how often do you hear whom anymore?
Yeah, not very often.
Even though some textbooks might still say it's the correct way.
It's fascinating. It's like language is a living thing, constantly adapting to how people use it.
Yeah.
So how do we navigate these changes then? Should we cling to the old rules or embrace the new?
That's a great question, and it leads to a really important point. The goal of language isn't to be perfectly correct according to some, arbitrary set of rules.
Right.
It's to communicate effectively.
So it's less about being a grammar stickler and more about being a flexible communicator.
Precisely. And that means understanding both the form and the use, and being able to adapt to how communication's always changing. This is seriously making me rethink my whole approach to grammar.
It's a journey, for sure,
Yeah.
not a destination.
Yeah.
And there's always something new to learn about how we use language to build meaning, connect with each other.
This reminds me of a point the source brings up, and it's kind of surprising. Just knowing the grammar rules, it doesn't automatically make you a good communicator.
That's so true. You can ace every grammar test and still, struggle to express yourself clearly
Yeah.
or even understand, like, the nuances of a conversation.
So what's the missing piece? What separates someone who just knows the rules versus someone who can really use language effectively?
I think it's a combination of things.
Mhm.
Awareness of the context, sensitivity to your audience,
Mm.
being willing to play with language.
Mm.
It's about seeing grammar not as a set of restrictions, but as a toolbox full of possibilities.
Oh, I love that. It's like knowing the notes on a piano doesn't make you a musician,
Yeah.
right? It's what you do with them, how you combine them.
Exactly.
That's the art.
That's where the magic happens.
Well, this has been eye-opening so far. I'm already seeing grammar in a whole new light. It's not just about rules and correctness. It's about this dynamic, this interplay of form and use, and how we use those to actually communicate, to create meaning.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
as we keep digging into this TKT Module 1, we're going to find even more fascinating stuff about how language works, how to use it well.
I'm ready. But before we move on, there's something in the source that really struck me, and I'd love to get your take on it. It mentions how young kids, they seem to learn grammar differently than, adults who are learning a second language. What are your thoughts on that?
That is a fascinating question. It really gets at how incredible the human brain is, how adaptable it is when it comes to learning language. I mean, we've all seen little kids just absorb their native language effortlessly.
Right. Like they just pick it up.
They pick up on the grammar, the nuances, without even realizing it.
They're little sponges.
Yeah.
But then for adults learning a second language, it feels so much more like a conscious effort,
It does. And while we won't get into all the nitty-gritty of language acquisition theories right now,
Sure.
it is worth pointing out that there are different cognitive processes at play. Young kids, they seem to have this innate ability to detect patterns, infer rules from the language they're exposed to, while adults, we often rely more on, like, explicit instruction, conscious effort.
That makes sense. So while kids are maybe learning more intuitively, adults might benefit from a more, structured approach.
It was probably a blend of both. Even young kids need interaction. They need guidance.
Yeah.
And adults can definitely tap into those intuitive abilities too.
Yeah.
The key is finding an approach that works for the learner, for their style.
So no one-size-fits-all method for mastering grammar.
Exactly. It's about finding the right balance.
Right.
Explicit instruction, intuitive learning, and most importantly, real-world practice.
I'm seeing a theme here. That balance between form and use, between rules and application, that's key to really getting grammar.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this deep dive so exciting.
Right.
We're not just looking at the what of grammar, but the why and the how. And that's where the real power of language comes alive. And speaking of the what of grammar, this training guide actually gives us a pretty nice list of the 9 parts of speech.
Yeah, the classics, the noun, verb, adjective crew.
Exactly. But some of those, those can be tricky.
Oh, absolutely. Like what even us a conjunction.
Yeah.
I remember the word, but remembering what it does in a sentence, that's a different story.
Right. So think of conjunctions like the bridges in our sentences, the words that connect different pieces,
Yes.
Whether it's single words, phrases, or whole clauses.
Okay.
Like and, but, or. Those are all conjunctions.
Right.
They're helping us express these more complex relationships between ideas.
So instead of just saying I like cats, I could say I like cats, but I'm allergic. The but adds that extra layer,
Yeah.
right? It shows the contrast.
Exactly. It's not just listing things anymore. It's showing how those pieces of information relate to each other.
I see, I see. And then there are those mysterious prefixes and suffixes. Ugh, those always felt like secret codes to me.
They're more like tools for building and modifying words. Prefixes like and unhappy. They go at the beginning, change the meaning, often to the opposite.
Okay.
Suffixes go at the end, like why, in, quickly. And they often change the grammatical role, like turning an adjective into an adverb.
So with unhappy, we've taken happy and just flipped it by adding those two letters at the beginning. And quickly we took quick and made it describe how something's done, turned it into an adverb.
Right. It's pretty amazing how much information those tiny little additions can pack. Small but powerful.
And the source even points out they can give us clues about the grammar, like whether a verb is past tense or a noun is plural.
For sure. Think about how adding ed to walk tells us it happened in the past, or adding s to book shows there's more than one. They're like little signposts guiding us through the structure.
Wow, this is making me realize how much I just take those little things for granted.
It's easy to. We use them so naturally. Yeah. But when you think about it, they really are quite something.
Now, this guide also dives into some more complex structures. I gotta admit, some of these always make my head spin a bit. Past, continuous, passive voice, prepositional phrases help.
They sound scarier than they are. They're just ways of describing those different patterns we use to build sentences, to create meaning.
Okay, that makes me feel a little better. So break it down. What's past continuous, for instance?
Past continuous, like was walking,
Hmm?
it shows us an action that was ongoing, but at a specific moment in the past, like a snapshot of something happening.
So if I say, I was walking to the store when I saw my friend, it means I was in the middle of walking when, bam, friend sighting.
Yeah, exactly. Sets the scene, emphasizes that the action was continuing, and then we have the passive voice. Instead of the boy threw the ball, we might say the ball was thrown by the boy, shifting the focus.
Less about who did it, more about the action itself.
Right. And that can be handy in certain contexts, like if you want to emphasize the object, or maybe the person doing the action is unknown or not important.
Okay, I'm kind of starting to see how these different structures can, create different effects in our writing or speaking, but I still get tripped up on when to use which one sometimes.
Oh, totally normal. Even native speakers, we don't think about those grammar terms all the time
Mm.
consciously. It's more about developing that feel for what sounds right, what conveys your meaning.
So it's like learning to ride a bike. At first you're wobbly, but then it's just you just do it.
Exactly. Practice and exposure, and you start to use those patterns naturally.
Less memorizing, more like getting a feel for the language.
Exactly. And this training guide, it actually gives us a handy little table, lists common structures and their uses, which can be a great starting point for learners and teachers.
Okay, let's take a peek at that table, see what we've got. First up, present simple tense.
Ah, present simple. It's like the workhorse of English. Describes habits, routines, states, facts, even talks about the future sometimes.
So, I drink coffee every morning. That's a habit. The earth is round. A fact. The train leaves at 8 a.m. Future, all present, simple.
Bingo. Super versatile, probably the first tense you ever learned.
And next we have the present perfect. Now this one always gets me a little bit. What's the key to unlocking this tricky tense?
Present perfect, it's all about connecting the past to the present.
Okay.
Like building that bridge between what happened before and how it's still relevant now.
Yeah.
It's for actions that happened, we don't know exactly when, but they have some impact on the present.
So if I say I have visited Paris, it means I've been there at some point, and that experience is still relevant to me now.
Exactly. It's not just the past event, it's how it continues to have a presence. It can also talk about actions that started in the past and are still going on, like I have lived in London for 5 years.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see that connection to the present a little more clearly. It's not just about the past, but how it's still shaping us, what we experience now.
Precisely. It's nuanced, but once you get that core concept, it's much easier to use.
And lastly, the source mentions adverbs. Now, I remember learning that adverbs describe verbs, but it seems like they do a lot more than that.
They do. They can modify verbs, yeah, like she sings beautifully, but they can also give more detail to adjectives. He's incredibly talented. Or even to other adverbs. She speaks very quickly.
So they're not just about actions, but about enhancing descriptions in all sorts of ways.
Think of them like the spice rack of language. They add flavor, nuance. We can create more vivid, engaging sentences. Instead of just, she walked, we could say, she walked slowly, or she walked confidently, or even, she walked surprisingly quickly.
I love that. It's like adverbs give us that power to fine-tune the meaning.
Precisely. They add detail, precision, make our communication more impactful.
Okay, so we've looked at the different parts of speech, we've gotten into some common structures, even touched on adverbs. Feels like we've taken a little tour of the building blocks of language.
We have. And now, this training resource, it shifts gears a bit. Focuses on insights for teachers, specifically how to teach grammar well.
Yeah, how to actually put all this knowledge to use.
Right, and it starts by emphasizing something we've talked about, that grammar rules, they're not set in stone, they change over time.
Right, it's like language is alive, it's dynamic, it's constantly adapting. And that can be challenging for both learners and teachers, right? Because what might have been considered correct a few decades ago might not be the standard today.
It's a good reminder that we need to be flexible in our approach to grammar.
Mm.
Can't cling to outdated rules or be afraid to embrace how language is evolving.
So how do we find that balance then between respecting the rules but also acknowledging they can change?
It's about understanding those underlying principles, the why behind the what, and then being able to apply those principles in different situations. It's less about rote memorization and more about developing a deeper understanding of how language actually works.
That makes sense. It's like if you understand the fundamental principles of music theory, you can then improvise and create your own melodies, even if they don't strictly adhere to every traditional rule.
Perfect analogy. It's about seeing grammar not as these rigid constraints, but as a set of tools you can use for creative expression.
And this training resource also highlights another really important point, that traditional grammar often prioritizes written language, which can be so different from spoken language.
Absolutely. Spoken language is much more fluid, spontaneous, and even, let's be honest, less grammatically perfect.
Think about how we use contractions, slang, and incomplete sentences in everyday conversation. That might be frowned upon in formal writing, but it's perfectly natural in spoken language.
Exactly. And it's important for teachers to acknowledge this distinction, to create learning environments that reflect both written and spoken communication.
So it's not about teaching students to speak like they write or write like they speak, but about understanding how both forms work and using them in the right situations.
Exactly. Which brings us back to that crucial balance of accuracy and fluency. We want learners to express themselves clearly and correctly, but also naturally and confidently.
It's like you can know all the steps to a dance, but if you can't let loose and move to the music, you're not really dancing, are you?
Love that. It's about finding that flow, that effortless expression, while still working within the structure and principles.
This is making me realize how much more there is to grammar than I ever realized. It's not just about rules and correctness. It's about the subtleties of language, how we use words to create meaning and connect with each other.
It really is. And the
Uh-huh.
more we explore those intricacies, the more we appreciate the beauty and the power of language.
This brings me to something the source points out, and it's a big one. The ultimate goal of language learning is communication, not just being perfect grammatically.
Such an important message, especially for people who are learning and might be feeling overwhelmed. It's not about being a grammar robot. It's about expressing yourself, connecting with others.
So fluency over flawlessness.
To a point, yeah. Accuracy matters, but it shouldn't come at the expense of being fluent, expressing yourself naturally.
That's really encouraging, actually. Takes the pressure off. Reminds us that language is about connection.
It is. It's about enjoying the journey, the learning process, the joy of finding new ways to express yourself.
This whole conversation is making me rethink my relationship with grammar. I used to see it as this rigid set of rules, but now I'm starting to appreciate how fluid it is, how creative, how it changes and adapts with us.
That's great to hear. And that change in perspective can be so freeing.
It is. And speaking of freeing, I think it's time to move on to a question that's been like bubbling up for me this whole time.
Oh, I love a good question. Hit me.
Okay, so we've talked about how grammar rules change over time, how language is evolving, but what about the future of grammar? Where do we even go from here?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's like looking into a crystal ball trying to imagine what the language landscape will be like down the road.
Exactly. If language is always adapting to how people use it, what might those adaptations look like in the future?
Well, I mean, we've already seen a ton of changes just in recent years. Think about the internet, social media,
Oh,
new
yeah.
words, new phrases popping up all the time.
Right, emojis, internet slang, they're not proper grammar, but they're how we communicate now.
And who knows what new forms of communication are coming. New tech, new trends, new cultural influences, all of that shapes how we use language, what the rules become.
It's kind of exciting, but a little scary, too,
Hmm.
thinking that how we speak now might sound totally different to future generations.
It is, but that's also part of what's so cool about language, you know? It adapts, it evolves, it reflects the world around us.
So grammar is less about predicting the future, more about embracing the present, acknowledging that things are constantly changing.
Exactly. We can't control how language will evolve, but we can be open to it. Appreciate how creative and inventive people are with language.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. I'm seeing grammar not as this rigid thing, but as this dynamic system that reflects us, how we connect.
And that's the key. Grammar isn't just about being correct, it's about the human experience.
Well said. But before we go full-on philosophical, let's come back to the source for a sec. There's a section on tips for teachers, like practical stuff for presenting grammar to students.
Yeah, and it really stresses making grammar relevant, engaging for learners.
Okay, but how do you make grammar come alive for students? Because, let's face it, it's not always the most thrilling topic.
It's all about finding those creative ways to connect it to their lives, their interests. Use real examples, interactive activities, games, technology. All that can make grammar less scary, more fun.
So ditch the boring lectures and make it more hands-on.
Exactly. The more students see grammar in action, the more they'll get it.
And that brings us back to context, doesn't it? Not just knowing the rules, but seeing how they're used in different situations.
For sure. So it's key for teachers to create those learning experiences where students see different contexts: reading, listening, speaking, writing.
Show them that grammar isn't just some abstract idea, it's a tool for communication, for connection.
Exactly. And when they see that, that's when the magic happens.
Man, this whole deep dive is making me wish I had learned grammar this way back in the day. It's so much more interesting when you see the bigger picture, how it all connects.
It's never too late to learn.
That's true.
And who knows, maybe this will inspire some listeners to, think about grammar differently, appreciate it in a new way.
I hope so, because as we've seen, grammar isn't the enemy. It's a powerful tool, and when we understand it, we can communicate better, connect with each other in more meaningful ways.
And as we keep exploring language, we'll find even more insights, more tools to help us express ourselves with clarity, confidence, and creativity.
I can't wait. But I think we've covered a lot today, given our listeners a lot to think about.
We have. From the basics to how form and use work together, we've really explored the essentials of grammar and how they shape how we communicate.
And hopefully we've busted the myth that grammar is this big, scary thing. It's fascinating, it's empowering, and when we understand it, it opens up a whole new world of communication.
True. And the more we explore grammar, the more we appreciate language itself.
I couldn't agree more. This whole deep dive has left me feeling like curious and full of wonder, not just about grammar, but about the power of language to connect us, to inspire us, to change the world.
And as we continue this exploration of communication, we'll discover even more, more insights, more tools to help us navigate it all, to really use the power of language.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this journey into the heart of language.
But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about as they continue on their language adventures.
Oh, I love a good parting thought. What is it?
Okay, so if language is constantly evolving, as we've said, and those grammar rules aren't fixed, then what responsibility do WE have, as the people who use language, to shape its future? How do we make sure language is inclusive, clear, and helps us understand each other, even as it keeps changing?
Whoa. That's a powerful question. It makes you think about our role and how language evolves, the impact our words have.
It does. We may not have all the answers, but it's a conversation worth having, to think about our choices, how they affect communication.
That's the perfect note to end on, giving our listeners a sense of, responsibility but also power as language users as part of this ongoing story of communication. It really makes you realize that language is more than just a set of rules. It's a reflection of who we are, how we think, and how we connect with each other.
It's this constantly evolving tapestry woven from our shared experiences, our ideas, and aspirations.
So what does this all mean for you, listening? If you're learning a language, teaching it, or just fascinated by how it all works, I think we've uncovered some big ideas today, all from this peek into TKT Module 1.
We've seen that grammar isn't just memorizing rules, it's understanding how those rules are used in different situations to create meaning. And those rules themselves can change. Language is dynamic.
And finding that balance, right? Accuracy and fluency. Knowing the rules but using language naturally, confidently.
Like learning to dance. You need to know the steps, but you gotta feel the rhythm, let loose, express yourself.
I love that analogy. It's communication in a nutshell. So next time you hit a grammar rule that's confusing or a sentence that sounds weird, Don't get discouraged.
See it as a chance to explore, to play with language, find new ways to express yourself.
Remember, language is a journey, not a destination. And the more you explore, the more you'll appreciate its beauty, its power.
And who knows, you might even find yourself, falling a little bit in love with grammar along the way.
On that note, we'll say goodbye to all you language lovers out there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into communication.
Keep exploring, keep asking those questions, keep having fun with words. See you next time.
Yeah, it really makes you think differently about language, doesn't it? That's not just these rules, it's like part of us, how we think, how we connect.
It's a constantly evolving thing, like a tapestry made from all our experiences, our ideas.
So what does this mean for everyone listening? Whether you're learning a language, teaching it, or just love thinking about how it all works? We got some big ideas today from this TKT Module 1 thing.
Yeah, we saw how grammar isn't about memorizing. It's about how those rules actually work in different situations to make meaning.
Yeah.
And those rules can change too. Language is dynamic.
And that balance we keep talking about, accuracy and defluency. Knowing the rules, but using language naturally, confidently.
It's like, learning to dance. You got to know the steps, but also feel the music. Let loose, express yourself.
I love that. That's communication in a nutshell. So anyone listening, next time you hit a grammar rule that just doesn't make sense or a sentence feels awkward, don't give up.
Think of it as a chance to explore, to play around with language. Find your own way to express yourself.
Remember, language is a journey, not a destination. The more you explore, the more you appreciate how beautiful, how powerful it is.
And who knows, you might find yourself kind of falling for grammar along the way.
Well, on that note, we'll say goodbye to all you language lovers out there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into communication.
Keep exploring, keep those questions coming, and most importantly, keep playing with words.